I believe they can be strengthened. And we would certainly welcome such a proposal.
Well, yeah, it might at least ensure we don't have to wait 20 years for the next Clwyd type of...
You know, they said that we've had inspectors before. Aren't they supposed to report to the government social services?
Okay, so what would be different about this?
I agree with what Zach said earlier. The inspections that have been carried out in the past have been rather superficial, part of the system. The virtue of Stephen Jumim's inspections were that they were entirely outside the system. He reported immediately, and I think you must have a structured annual report. You see, we've had so many reports, as you said at the beginning. Who checks whether the recommendations have been put into effect? No one. This is what the Commissioner for Children's Rights would do. He would say, Alan Levy's report made these recommendations about recruitment of unqualified staff from the job centre. That would have to be examined publicly and explained every year.
Now, let's look at one or two of the other proposals made today, because although it's taken 20 or more years to get around to these proposals, and they're not yet law, they are only proposals from the Home Secretary, this idea of a register for convicted paedophiles, what do you think about that, Zach Savio?
I think it's a very good idea, obviously, if it's accessible. I mean, I know that Mike Hames, who used to work for Scotland Yard, suggested this 3-4 years ago, and only recently has developed something, you know, for people's use. But, you know, it wasn't implemented in 1991. It wasn't invented in the 80s when it all started. I mean, how long?
Would you in social services welcome it, Tad Kabisa?
We certainly welcome any tracking of known paedophiles would be helpful. But as Ian White said earlier, the problem is that many paedophiles escape conviction, and therefore you do have a group of people that you have to have other means of monitoring their activities, which must be about the standards in residential care, which have already been touched upon. Which means that we must, if I can finish, it means that we must put more resources into residential care to ensure that those people that surround children and young people who have great needs are the best qualified staff that we have. That hasn't happened yet. It's only happened partially. Because in itself, if there are a number of professional staff around, they will notice when things are not going properly.
Mr. Kabisa, I mean, you are talking about this somehow as if it's happening somewhere else. Have you got any suggestions yourself to improve how you do the job?
We have made several improvements. As I said earlier, the situations which are coming out now, most of these events occurred, and indeed this evening we've seen examples of it in the 70s and 80s. Since 1971, a number of authorities have put in place far more rigorous techniques for interviewing people, so that you will follow up their previous work record. You will look for gaps in that work record, because we know that paedophiles will drop out of work for a few months and years and then re-emerge. We will look very critically at their references, and we will always do police checks. Now, all those things will help, but we do need other safeguards, such as a commissioner, such as a register of paedophiles, and a review of the consultancy register, which is run by the Department of Health.
Now, what do you think about this idea, Lord Williams?
The register, it's a useful first step, a very limited one. The fact is that quite often offenders of this sort have gone from one local authority to another, either with a reference or with silence.
And the problem is not necessarily the convicted offender.
It is not.
Just very quickly, Zach Savio, after all this time, one pronouncement after another, one inquiry after another, do you get the sense today that we're finally beginning to see some action?
No, just as Mr. Tabisco just said, he thinks that it was 80s. I mean, I know the abuse happened personally to myself and others till 1992, 93. So I don't know where he gets his figures from or dates from. But do you not think that it's wise maybe to set up an inspectorate of, like, you know, Voices from Care, something away from your care as social services, which is free to that?
Indeed. What I said was the majority of these situations arise from that time. There, of course, are situations which continue.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Politicians in Dublin, Belfast, London and Washington heaped scorn on the IRA today for the Manchester bombing. The Irish government announced it was reviewing its relationship with Sinn Féin and wanted a clear answer on whether they support the IRA's armed struggle or not. The loyalist terror group, the Ulster Freedom Fighters, warned darkly that it was now on full alert for a resumption of IRA activities in Northern Ireland, suggesting an imminent return to the campaign of sectarian killings which went on before the ceasefire. In the midst of it all, the voice of Senator George Mitchell saying the peace process had to continue. But how can it when there is no peace? Mark Mardell reports.
The signs are becoming ever clearer that the hardliners are back in charge.
Don't be confused about the politics of the situation. Don't be confused about things like decommissioning. The only thing that the Republican movement will accept is the decommissioning of the British state in this country. And those who don't want peace will get war.
Was the moment the lorry exploded in Manchester the turning point, when IRA hardliners finally shattered the peace process beyond repair? British intelligence sources have been telling the British government another ceasefire is not on the cards. They believe the IRA is preparing more big bombs and the assassination of an MP or civil servant. Irish intelligence evaluations suggest that recently the IRA has been recruiting new members, buying and developing new weapons, as one analyst puts it, digging in for a long war.
They have been looking to Eastern Europe in recent times for more war material. And this is despite the fact that they already have a very large arsenal, largely arms that were brought in from Libya in the mid-1980s. Like, they have an oversupply of assault rifles. They have well over 600 assault rifles. They've up to 3 tons of Semtex. So if these reports are true, that they are looking to Eastern Europe, this suggests that they are thinking in the long term.
The talks continued anyway, with one loyalist party warning the IRA was about to bring violence back to the province and they'd be ready. Even with a ceasefire, Sinn Féin would not now be allowed in. The British government would want much more. Tory MPs simply wouldn't allow it.
You cannot appease terrorism. You cannot do a deal with evil because it is just one-sided concession. We are facing a situation where internment may be the only avenue open. I have always been against it, but it does begin to look as though if Sinn Féin and IRA are determined to flout democracy, to flout the will of the people, then what choice do we have if we're going to try and defend those people and to defend democracy?
Without IRA Sinn Féin, the talks can't deliver peace, but some believe there can still be a big prize at the end.
If it did take off, Catholics and Protestants would be seen to be running the place together, and also the Irish people, both north and south, would have decided and said clearly, this is the settlement for today, the settlement that we want. Very hard for groups outside that to say, as the IRA did after Canary Wharf, that they are prosecuting Irish national claims. The Irish people will have said clearly what they consider to be a viable settlement of the Irish national claim to be.
Excluded from the talks, some feel Gerry Adams is also being shut out of higher Republican councils, that he's lost the argument for a more political approach. Others think any appearance of hawks and doves is all a charade.
Shock, regret and sadness to their family.
Today he came up with a rather curious statement.
The IRA is an organisation, and I note that no one has claimed this explosion in Manchester, but that the IRA is not Sinn Féin and we are not the IRA, and that Sinn Féin have a peace strategy, and I will not allow our contribution to be either undervalued or discarded. We have, I think, taken...
His priority could be to avoid a split. In some senses, Irish history this century has been defined by IRA men abandoning the armed struggle and coming into the constitutional fold. In 1921, IRA Sinn Féin was split over whether to accept the treaty which established Northern Ireland. Civil war was the result. In 1926, Fianna Fáil was formed when De Valera broke away from Sinn Féin. Another split in the 40s led to a new party and a change of government. And in the 70s, the official IRA tried to end the conflict and called a ceasefire. Those who refused to accept it became the Provos.
I think that one of the main things on the mind of Gerry Adams and the people, the leadership group around him at the moment, would be to keep the Republican movement together. And if they are faced with a choice between going into the wilderness because they cannot get into all-party talks or be accepted as a constitutional party, if it's a choice between that and keeping the movement together by going into the political wilderness, it would be my judgment that Gerry Adams and the people around him would grit their teeth and go back into the wilderness.
The Dublin government may help them on their way. It seems Mr Bruton is ready to bury Sinn Féin. He's demanding to know, does the political party still back the IRA's violence, and has it asked for a new ceasefire?
This time they must speak not out of the clever lexicon of evasive words, but straight from their hearts, saying in language that nobody can misunderstand, and they must choose that language, we don't support the IRA campaign of violence.
After Manchester, Dublin may be willing to give Sinn Féin one last chance, but few British politicians think there's much point in talking to a party that's either lost its influence over the men of violence or doesn't really wish to curb them.
And we're joined now from Belfast by Seamus Mallon of the SDLP and Ian Paisley Jr. of the DUP. Seamus Mallon, what's the point of continuing with the meetings after what happened in Manchester?
Well, I think implicit in that question is the political process here capable of solving the problems, or are those problems going to be solved by the people with guns? I believe that the political process here must continue, that it must try to solve those problems, and I refuse to give a veto to the IRA or Sinn Féin, just the same as I refused ever to give it to any of the unionist factions. And you know, there's an inherent danger in the type of reaction we're getting now, which in effect in a contradictory way says that we cannot continue with peace for the very good reason that the people who planted the bomb in Manchester are not part of this process.
Right. Ian Paisley, what is your view? Is there any point in continuing meetings after what happened in Manchester?
Well, can I say that I think that the horrible and horrific bomb in Manchester was a deliberate message and a calculated message from the Provisional IRA to Her Majesty's government, which simply says, give nothing to the unionists or else. And I think that we are falling into a trap, a very carefully choreographed trap, if we believe that there's splits in the IRA. The IRA are calculated, they are ruthless, and they are determined to get their own way and use armed struggle when it suits and use non-armed struggle when it suits.
Right. That was an answer to a question I hadn't actually asked, although thank you very much for it. Is there any point in continuing the talks then?
Well, I think as Seamus says, you know, I believe that there's other politicians involved in all of this.
Right.
Sinn Féin represent a very tiny section of the community. The other 85% of the community deserve to be represented and deserve to get on together. Our biggest problem with the SDLP is when we don't question their commitment to peace, we question their judgment on how to get peace, and we question their leadership's judgment on how to get peace.
But the problem is that you both speak for constitutional democratic parties committed to peaceful means. Now, without the presence of Sinn Féin, I mean, I take it you accept the minimum, the Dublin government's conditions for their taking part, which are, you know, that they asked the IRA for a ceasefire and then they ceased to support the armed struggle. I mean, that presumably is an absolute minimum, isn't it, Seamus Mallon?
Well, I think it's a moment of truth for everybody. It's a moment of truth for the Sinn Féin. They are either going to continue with this notion that somehow or another they are going to protect the unity of their Republican organisation, or they're going to have to make the decision to go into the political process. That's their moment of truth. But I think there's a moment of truth for everyone, all of us included, where in effect, if we give up on the democratic political process, then in effect we're leaving the door open for the men of violence within the IRA, the UVF, the UDA, and everywhere else. And we must proceed with the attempt to get a negotiated agreement, and we should be doing that now with much more resolve, not talking down the chances of doing that, not in effect scorning the prospects of such an agreement being reached, but making sure that it will happen, because let's not forget, there are certain things different here. You have two governments very centrally involved. You have the United States through Senator Mitchell, centrally involved in chairing these talks and these negotiations. I know it is incomplete without Sinn Féin, but the choice is theirs. And it is not a matter of what John Major has said or John Bruton has said. It is the fact that they themselves have to refuse to distance themselves from the organisation and the perpetration of violence. And because of that, I believe the entire political process must stand up, not just for the political process, but against the standards that are being imposed or have been attempted to be imposed by Sinn Féin.
Well, of course, you're both politicians and you believe in politics and you believe in trying to resolve conflicts politically. But what was distinctive about this particular process, as opposed to the political initiatives that have taken place in Northern Ireland in the past, was that they did appear to offer the possibility of engaging those people who took another view, who thought that things could be resolved through violence. Now, can you deliver peace, do you think, Ian Paisley?
Well, I don't believe that the politicians can actually deliver peace. I think that politicians can only negotiate a way forward with other constitutional politicians. I think that it's completely irrelevant, and I think that it's unrealistic for us to believe that we can suddenly persuade the IRA that it's in their interest to give up balance when all along they have demonstrated, and this is where I must say that it's the British government's fault in this issue, where they have demonstrated that by bombing and killing they can squeeze concessions from the British government. Now it's up to the British government therefore to adopt a policy, a security policy, which says to the terrorists, you get nothing from us because of your violence. And that's what I want to see adopted as a result of Manchester, and which ought to have been adopted a very long time ago.
Seamus Mellon, very quickly.
There's no such thing as a political solution. It has failed for the past 25 years. It failed over the decades. Why go back to something which has failed when, in effect, we know that sitting in the midst of the island of Ireland, we have got the two sovereign governments trying to organise a political agreement where we have got the international intervention and where I hope we have the will of the entire people to do it.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Now, in a moment, President Yeltsin's narrow win in the first round of the Russian elections, but before that, some of today's other news. MPs are now voting on the most radical changes to the divorce laws for a generation. It's believed that the government has made enough concessions to opposition and backbenchers to get its family law bill through. The new laws will introduce no-fault divorces where no one has to be shown to be at fault, but which take a minimum of 12 months or 18 months if children are involved. A White House spokesman has today described allegations that Hillary Clinton tried to obstruct a Senate investigation into the Whitewater affair as election year smears. The rebuttal comes as two former associates of President Clinton have gone on trial accused of making illegal contributions to one of his political campaigns. Women who use the contraceptive pill face a small but increased risk of breast cancer for up to 10 years after they finish taking it, according to a survey. A study by the Imperial Cancer Research Fund found 1% more cases of breast cancer in women who'd taken the pill. A volcano on New Zealand's North Island has erupted, sending huge clouds of ash and steam into the air. It's the second time Mount Ruepu, if that's the correct name, has erupted in 8 months. No one was hurt, but residents have been advised to stay inside or wear gas masks. Sir Fitzroy MacLean, one of the most glamorous figures from the last war, has died at 85. An early member of the SAS, he served as Churchill's personal envoy to Tito, where he fought with the partisans, an experience he recalled in his best-selling memoirs, Eastern Approaches. He was often thought to be the model for James Bond. On the markets, the 100 share index closed up 8 points at 37.62. In New York, the Dow Jones closed up 3 points at 56.52 against the mark. The pound rose 3/4 of a pfennig to 2 marks. 34.6 on Wall Street. The pound rose 2/3 of a cent to $1.54.3. It was a close-run thing, and nothing like as decisive as he boasted it would be. But Boris Yeltsin did come out tops in the Russian presidential elections. Now the horse trading begins, ahead of the second-round runoff between Mr. Yeltsin and the communist Gennady Zyuganov. The man who came third, the retired general Alexander Lebed, has already been called in for Kremlin chats in which it's rumoured jobs and portfolios and dachas were discussed. Our diplomatic correspondent Mark Urban is in Moscow. Mark.
Well, Jeremy, this was the day that President Yeltsin discovered he was in for a marathon rather than a sprint. There were 10 candidates in this election, so very few people expected him to win outright on the first round with a full 50% of the vote. Few people except Yeltsin himself. He had predicted he would. There'll now have to be a second round, and in the meantime, the attention will switch to the runners-up. President Yeltsin got 35% of the vote. His communist opponent, Gennady Zyuganov, got 32%. The real surprise was Alexander Lebed's third place with just under 15%. The followers of Grigory Yavlinsky, the liberal economist, were disappointed with his fourth place, and among the also-rans, Mikhail Gorbachev polled a pretty miserable 0.5%, showing that even if he is still revered in the West, people here have a pretty low opinion of him. The field now narrows to two candidates, Yeltsin and Zyuganov, and none of the runners-up have yet endorsed either of them. This evening, they'd counted 99% of the vote, and it became clear that while the Russian people had spoken on the great issues of the election, they had not done so with a clear voice. 1/3 had voted for candidates other than Yeltsin or Zyuganov. allowing each of the prime candidates to claim that the middle ground really supported them.
The majority of you have made the right decision. You have voted for a new life, but your sympathies were divided among several candidates, and not one of them could win in the first round.
He lost many millions of votes because of economic reforms. It's a crushing defeat.
Yesterday in Zelenograd, a modern Moscow suburb, the Burmistrovs arrived to vote. They're committed communists and so cast their votes for Gennady Zyuganov. After the polling station doors were closed at 10, Ivan began his duties as an observer. The ballot boxes were opened. It quickly became clear both that the vote had been conducted fairly, particularly in well-observed places like this, and that Yeltsin would do very well in Moscow. The Zelenograd vote was running 8-1 in the president's favor, worse than the communists were expecting. But there was a bigger picture. The TV brought news of a better communist vote in other parts of the country, and that General Alexander Lebed had done better than most people expected.
Well, we'll have something new happening. Who will attract General Lebed to his side? Either Yeltsin will offer him some post, or Zyuganov might include him in the coalition government. There will be some political haggling involved, but, in my opinion, you've got to have principles.
Lebed's appeal is that of the macho ex-paratrooper. In 1992, he took command of the Russian army in Moldova, where there was fierce fighting. He shelled both sides into submission, pursuing his own policy largely independent of Moscow.
He understood that the leaders simply didn't want to deal with him, so he made his own decisions. When I spoke to him, he said quite frankly, I realize if things go wrong, I'll go to prison. I'll be labeled the bloody general, a criminal, and so on. Nevertheless, he did take full responsibility.
The former general's election campaign has made much of his honesty and toughness. He's been the first to admit that his strategy is more about image than substance.
At the moment, the thicker the programme, the less the chances that anyone will bother to take notice of it. Nowadays, nobody votes for a particular programme or party or movement. They will vote for individuals, for those they can trust.
As it became clear last night that the gravelled-voiced general might hold the political balance of power, he began to dictate his terms.
I have only one thing to do, to live up to their expectations. I have declared in my programme that this country needs normal, humane law and order. I will try to achieve it. I declared that the country needs reforms, including reforms in the army, if we want to stay sovereign and independent. It is our duty, for the sake of the future, to crush crime. I will start tomorrow.
Tonight, at the end of the day in which the general's importance has increased enormously, Yeltsin and Zyuganov are both trying to gain the middle ground in their struggle for the Kremlin. Well, two members of Russia's Duma, or parliament, join me now to discuss that struggle. Alexei Albatov, whose party leader Grigory Yavlinsky came fourth in yesterday's vote, and Alexei Podberyoskin, who is one of Gennady Zyuganov's advisors. Alexei Albatov, can I ask you firstly, do you think that Yeltsin is going to get Lebed's backing now?
Yes, I think so.
He's playing it quite cool at the moment, though, isn't he? Why is that?
Well, that's always the tactic you use when you bargain. But I have some reasons to expect that they finally will fix a deal.
What sort of thing do you think he'll expect from Mr. Yeltsin?
Well, there are different rumors. The latest one is that Yeltsin proposed to General Lebed the post of vice premier responsible for all power structures.
Those are the security ministries and others.
And the armed forces and everything.
Now, what do you think he can give to your own leader, Mr. Yavlinsky, who obviously is a more liberal political figure and a more likely political backer for his campaign?
We are not interested in any particular post in Yeltsin's government. But we might render support to Yeltsin only if he changes his policy of the recent years, in particular stopping war in Chechnya and changing economic policy, and if he changes the people in his team. That's the condition. Our support is very heavily conditioned. It's not for the personality of Mr. Yeltsin.
Mr. Podberyelskin, what do you think Gennady Zyuganov can offer General Lebed to stop him going with Yeltsin?
This particular proposition will be discussed tomorrow, and after the meeting with Zyuganov, it will be discussed in a closed meeting between the leaders of the opposition, which are supporting Zyuganov. So I think that the answer may be very, very different. For example, tomorrow, one of the leaders of the opposition proposed to discuss the problem of nominating him a premier. That's
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, yes.
What would you say to the suggestion that the only way that Mr. Zyuganov can now beat Yeltsin is to stand aside and let General Lebed lead the coalition against Yeltsin?
As to me, it means, the support of Lebed or Zhirinovsky means nothing, because the voters who supported Lebed and Zhirinovsky, at least 2/3 of them, support Zyuganov in any case. And whether Lebed or Zhirinovsky like it or not, they still support and they will support Zyuganov.
But do you think there is any possibility that Mr. Zyuganov might actually stand aside and let General Lebed lead the National Patriotic Coalition, which he has formed, which Mr. Zyuganov formed, to contest this election?
I wouldn't exclude anything. You see, that is the principal position of Zyuganov, started from January this year, when he proclaimed and then strongly supported the idea of coalition government with everybody, including Yavlinsky and even some people from administration and the government. So that is his principal position. It is explained very simply. Our country is ruining now as quickly as it was before, and we are facing the same problem, especially in the economy and social life, which must be resolved as quickly as possible. And no one party, no one leader can resolve this alone. That is the idea of coalition, to resolve the problem, not to fight for the power. That's his concept.
Mr. Abatov, you represent one of those centre parties that are now being fought for, as it were. Do you agree with Mr. Podberyelskin that the voters cannot be relied upon to swing behind Mr. Yeltsin, even if your party leader and General Lebed tell them they should?
Well, as I will only, first I'll speak about my own party. Our people will not support us if we just strike a deal with Yeltsin and get some positions in the government. They will turn away from us. We lead them only as long as we fulfill their values and their wishes.
Alexei Podberyelskin, Alexei Abatov, thank you both very much. Well, of course, neither Mr. Lebed nor Mr. Yavlinsky have joined either side as we leave you tonight. But that's all from Moscow. Back to Jeremy in the studio.
Thanks, Mark. Tomorrow morning's front page is the Herald Tribune leads on news of the latest poll results in Russia, and pension split deal to save divorce law. The Times and indeed the Guardian and the Telegraph have news of the government's victory. According to these, they must have been written before the vote, in getting the divorce bill through the House of Commons. Loyalist group warns of return to violence in Ulster as the front page in the Financial Times, and the Daily Mirror gives us all some advice to talk up the England team chances when they play Holland tomorrow afternoon. That's all from Newsnight tonight. I'll be back with more tomorrow night. Until then, from all of us on the programme, good night.